So this is actually the image that is on the cent in your pocket.
Cory Harrison, the son of Pawn Stars star Rick Harrison, collapsed in court after hearing the verdict that would seal his fate: life without parole. Once the charming, quick-witted pawnshop star who captivated viewers with his sharp humor, Cory's downfall was swift and brutal. Convicted of involvement in a vast criminal network tied to human trafficking, money laundering, and smuggling, Cory's actions shattered the public's trust. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Cory's face went pale, and he crumpled to the floor in disbelief, unable to comprehend the weight of his fall from fame to a prison cell. His collapse symbolized the final collapse of the Harrison family's empire, once built on deception and greed. The rise of a TV star, Cory Harrison was a TV prince, a slick-talking king whose charisma had captivated millions. With a smile that could disarm anyone and a voice smooth as velvet, he charmed his way into the hearts of viewers. On the show, he was the quick-witted, sharp-tongued pawnshop heir who seemed to know everything about everything. His banter with customers and his father, Rick, was a highlight of the show. The gold and silver pawnshop, located just off the Las Vegas Strip, became a cultural landmark. People from around the world tuned in to see the family negotiate over rare coins, vintage guitars, and priceless relics, all while cracking jokes and exchanging sarcastic
That's pretty
remarks.
cool.
But the truth was far darker than the facade Cory presented. Off-screen, the charm was just a mask for a much more sinister character. Beneath the television persona was a man driven by greed, ambition, and a hunger for power that would ultimately consume him. Cory was no longer just the heir to a pawn empire. He was the architect of a vast criminal operation, one that extended far beyond the pawnshop's walls. The dark secrets of the pawn shop. What the millions of Pawn Stars fans didn't see were the dirty dealings that took place behind the scenes. The gold and silver pawn shop had built its reputation on being a place where treasures from history passed through the hands of everyday people who would trade their most valuable possessions for quick cash. Rick Harrison, the patriarch of the shop, had a sharp eye for rare items and an instinct for striking deals that turned old junk into gold. His talent for negotiation and his knowledge of history made the pawn shop a mecca for rare artifacts and unique treasures. But as the pawn shop grew in fame, so did its darker dealings. The shop, once a small family-owned business, became a machine that operated on a much larger scale, one that involved money laundering, stolen artifacts, and worse, human trafficking. Cory, who had been raised in this world of fast cash and quick deals, had slowly come to view the shop not just as a business, but as a means to an end. It wasn't enough to make money through legitimate sales. He needed more. He craved the power and the wealth that came with it, and the pawn shop's success became the perfect cover for his increasingly illegal activities. It all started small. At first, Cory began dealing in stolen paintings, purchasing art for a fraction of its worth and reselling it for millions. It was a lucrative business, and the pawn shop was the perfect front. Then came the shell companies, designed to launder money and move illicit funds through offshore accounts. No one noticed at first. The transactions were slick, well hidden beneath layers of false paperwork and fake records. But as the years passed, the deals became more brazen, the stakes higher, the web of crime. But it wasn't just art that was being laundered through the gold and silver pawn shop. Cory had his hands in much darker dealings. Rare Egyptian statuettes, Renaissance daggers, and priceless historical relics were stolen from around the world and funneled into the pawn shop's inventory. Each item, carefully disguised, passed through Cory's hands before disappearing into the black market. The shop had become a hub for stolen history, with Cory acting as the broker between thieves and buyers. It was during this period that the whispers began. Employees at the pawn shop noticed strange transactions. Paintings bought for pennies, large sums of money moving through invisible channels. A bookkeeper named Claire Voss was the first to investigate. She found discrepancies in the financial records, irregularities that suggested something wasn't right. But when she brought her concerns to Rick, she was met with a cold response. His smile was smooth, his words slick as snake oil. "Business is growing, Claire," he told her. "Stay in your lane." A week later, Claire was gone. Her desk was empty and her questions buried. But the whispers continued to swell, and soon the FBI was circling, their eyes focused on the gold and silver pawn shop. The FBI investigation. The FBI's investigation was methodical but slow. At first, it seemed like just another routine case, but as the agents dug deeper, they uncovered something far larger and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The tip-off came from Claire Voss, whose notes had made their way to a trusted contact. The feds began with a financial audit of the pawn shop, tracing large withdrawals, unexplained payments, and cash flowing to mysterious shell companies. As they followed the money trail, they discovered something chilling. Cory Harrison's name was everywhere. His signature was on nearly every shady deal, his fingerprints on every criminal transaction. The pawn shop, once a symbol of Americana, was revealed to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. Each deal was a carefully orchestrated crime, disguised as a legitimate pawn transaction. The feds found records linking Cory to offshore accounts, drug cartels, and even human trafficking rings. The operation was vast, spanning continents and involving dozens of criminal organizations. The pawn shop wasn't just a place where people traded their possessions. It had become a conduit for some of the most heinous crimes in the world. The human trafficking network. Perhaps the darkest secret of all was the human trafficking operation that Cory had orchestrated. The pawn shop served as a front for a network that preyed on the desperate and vulnerable. Women and children, lured to Las Vegas with promises of work and a better life, were caught in the web of exploitation. Maria Delgado, a young woman from Juarez, was one of the victims. She had been promised a job as a maid and a new life in Vegas, but when she arrived, she found herself trapped in a nightmare. Her belongings were pawned at the shop, including a silver locket that held her only connection to her past. Javier Ruiz, a 19-year-old from Guatemala, was another victim. Promised a construction job, he pawned his father's watch to fund his journey to Las Vegas. But when he arrived, he was forced to work in a warehouse, his days filled with grueling labor and his nights filled with fear. Cory Harrison was the man behind it all, coordinating their movements, ensuring they stayed off the radar. Their lives were nothing more than transactions, pawns in his larger game of profit. The fall of an empire. The FBI's breakthrough came in 2024 when a smuggler named Vince the Rat Caruso flipped. He provided crucial testimony, detailing Cory's role in the illegal operations. The feds moved swiftly, raiding Rick Harrison's villa at dawn. Agents stormed the property, seizing computers, ledgers, and encrypted drives that held the key to unraveling the entire operation. Emails, financial records, and photos of victims were recovered, each piece of evidence pointing to Cory as the mastermind behind the criminal empire. The trial that followed was a media frenzy, with reporters swarming the courtroom like vultures. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on a mountain of evidence that left no room for doubt. Dr. Lena Ellis, a forensic accountant, took the stand, presenting a damning financial trail that traced millions of dollars through various shell companies and offshore accounts. Vince Caruso, the former smuggler, detailed his meetings with Cory, describing the illicit deals they had made. Victims like Maria and Javier testified, their voices trembling with the weight of their suffering. Cory Harrison, once the golden boy of Pawn Stars, sat in that courtroom, his TV charm a distant memory. The evidence was overwhelming, and his empire, built on lies and blood money, was crumbling before his eyes. The world that had once adored him was now watching as he was exposed for the criminal mastermind he truly was. The verdict was inevitable. Cory was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The empire he had helped build was no more, and the pawn shop, once a symbol of American ingenuity, was now nothing more than a monument to corruption, greed, and betrayal. A glimpse into the past, the pawn shop's glittering lie. Cory Harrison's life seemed like a fairy tale to those who watched the hit TV show Pawn Stars. Behind the neon glow of the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas, viewers were introduced to a world of antiques, relics, rare coins, and high-stakes deals. Cory's charm, quick wit, and ability to talk anyone into a deal made him a fan favorite. His rise to fame seemed like destiny. The Harrison family, led by patriarch Rick Harrison, had built an empire, turning a small pawn shop into a must-visit Vegas landmark. The cameras followed their every move, documenting the world of rare finds, negotiations, and backroom dealings. But as the cameras rolled, a much darker reality unfolded behind the scenes. The pawn shop, once a symbol of Vegas glitz and glamour, was also the epicenter of a criminal operation that spanned continents. At its heart was Cory, the pawn shop prince. While he presented himself as a fun-loving jokester on screen, in reality, Cory was far from innocent. He was a key player in a machine that trafficked human lives, laundered millions, and smuggled stolen relics. The truth would eventually unravel, exposing a dark underbelly of greed, exploitation, and betrayal. The victims, Maria, Javier, and Anna's stories. Among the many victims of the Harrison Empire, 3 stories stood out: Maria, Javier, and Anna. These were the faces of the victims who would eventually bring Cory to his knees. Their tragic journeys would become the foundation of the investigation that ultimately led to Cory's conviction. Maria, a young woman from Mexico, was promised a better life working as a waitress in Las Vegas. But her journey quickly turned into a nightmare. Lured by an advertisement that promised legitimate work for $500 a week, Maria was brought to Vegas, her papers forged, her identity stolen. She was a pawn in a cruel game, forced into labor and, eventually, trapped in the pawn shop's exploitation ring. Her last possession of value, a locket given to her by her mother, would be pawned for a meager $10, the currency of her suffering. Javier's story was no less tragic. Promised a stable job and a fresh start, he found himself in debt the moment he arrived in Vegas. His watch, a symbol of his family's pride and his father's legacy, would also be sold to the pawn shop for a fraction of its worth, a reminder of how much he had lost. Anna, another victim from Honduras, was drawn to the city with the hope of earning enough to support her family. Her journey ended in tragedy, as her ring, a gift from her mother, was pawned for just $5. The investigation, unraveling the Harrison Empire. The investigation that brought down the Harrison family began with a tip from Claravos, a former employee of the pawn shop. Claravos had worked in the shop's back office, where she had witnessed strange financial transactions and deals that didn't add up. Her suspicions grew as she noticed large sums of money being moved through shell companies and fake accounts. When she was fired for asking too many questions, Claravos knew she had to act. She passed along her suspicions to Sam Tate, an investigative reporter who had long suspected that there was more to the pawn shop than met the eye. Tate contacted an FBI agent who began digging into the shop's finances. What they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. Financial records showed that the shop was being used to launder millions of dollars. Wire transfers from cartel fronts were traced back to the shop. Shell companies were used to funnel money into accounts in Panama, the Cayman Islands, and Dubai. The operation was vast, spanning multiple continents and involving multiple criminal networks. The investigation revealed that Cory Harrison was far more than just a pawn in his father's scheme, as his defense attorney Victor Hargrove had tried to argue. Cory wasn't some naive young man coerced into criminality by his father. He was a key player. His role in the trafficking ring, his oversight of the money laundering operations, and his dealings with dangerous criminals made him complicit in the crimes, not a mere bystander. The trial, a glimpse into Cory's cold heart. Cory's trial was a spectacle that captivated the public. The once-beloved pawn shop star was now the face of betrayal and exploitation. As the prosecution presented their evidence, emails, financial records, testimonies from former employees and victims, it became clear that Cory had played a central role in the criminal operation. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails from Cory, dated back to 2022, ordered the movement of victims and the keeping of certain individuals off the grid. A ledger entry in Cory's handwriting logged a $2 million wire transfer, its source traced to a cartel front. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Cory's involvement in the trafficking ring. He wasn't just the charming pawn shop employee who could talk anyone into a bad deal. Off camera, Cory was meeting with criminals in back rooms, facilitating the shop's darker dealings and ensuring that the money flowed freely. The defense's case, led by Victor Hargrove, was a last-ditch effort to salvage Cory's reputation. Hargrove tried to paint Cory as a victim of his father's manipulation, claiming that Cory had been a pawn in Rick Harrison's game. But the evidence was too strong. Emails, financial records, victim testimonies, and former employees who had been silenced by bribes all pointed to Cory as a willing participant in the crimes. The jury, after deliberating for 3 days, found Cory guilty. When the judge sentenced Cory to life without parole, the courtroom erupted in shock. Cory's collapse in the courtroom, his body crumpling under the weight of the verdict, was a symbol of the Harrison Empire's fall from grace. The fallout. Cory's life behind bars. For Cory, the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a new chapter, one of isolation, regret, and despair. The once celebrated pawnshop star was now a convicted felon, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. His fall from grace was swift and brutal. The once vibrant pawn shop, a symbol of the Harrison family's empire, was now a ghost of its former self. Tourists who had once lined up to catch a glimpse of the shop now turned away in disgust. The media had turned on Cory, and his fall from TV stardom to prison life became the subject of mockery and scorn. Inside the prison walls, Cory's life was a far cry from the fame and luxury he had once enjoyed. The man who had thrived on applause now faced the silence of a concrete cell. He woke each day to the clanging of steel doors and the grind of prison life. His meals were bland and tasteless, a far cry from the gourmet food he had once enjoyed. His hands, once polished and clean, were now rough and raw from the work he was assigned. The guilt, too, was ever present. Maria's locket, Javier's watch, and Anna's ring haunted him. Their faces, their stories, played out in his mind every night, reminding him of the lives he had ruined. In prison, Cory's charm was useless. Inmates saw him as just another number, a criminal, someone who had betrayed the trust of the public. His wit, which had once made him a fan favorite, now only served to remind him of what he had lost. Rick Harrison, the enigma and the legacy of betrayal. While Cory's life was now defined by regret and guilt, Rick Harrison's story was far from over. The patriarch of the Harrison family had long been the face of the pawn shop, the mastermind behind its success. But as the investigation closed in on Cory, the shadow of suspicion began to loom over Rick as well. Financial records showed that Rick had been involved in questionable transactions too. A wire transfer from 2022 totaling $5 million had been traced to a cartel front. The feds had also uncovered emails linking Rick to criminal networks. His silence in the face of mounting evidence spoke volumes. Was Rick the mastermind behind the empire, pulling the strings from the shadows? Or was he simply blinded by ambition, unaware of the full extent of his son's criminal activities? For now, Rick remained silent. But the feds were closing in. Their questions were sharper, their patience thinner. As the investigation continued, it was clear that Rick Harrison's time was running out. Vegas in the wake of the Harrison dynasty. The fallout from the Harrison family's crimes spread like wildfire. The once celebrated pawn shop was now a symbol of betrayal and corruption. Vegas, a city built on illusions and deception, now had a new stain on its reputation. The lights of the Strip shone brighter without the shadow of the Harrison name, but the scars of their empire would never fully fade. The media frenzy continued, with headlines like Harrison's Empire of Lies and Vegas Dynasty's Dark Secret dominating news cycles. Late-night hosts had a field day with the story, mocking Cory's fall from TV star to convicted felon. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags, turning Cory's downfall into a spectacle for all to see. But in the midst of the public outrage, there was a darker truth. The victims' voices. Maria, Javier, Anna, and the hundreds of others who had fallen victim to the Harrison family's empire were not forgotten. Their stories were the driving force behind the investigation, and their courage in testifying helped bring the truth to light. A legacy of deceit. The rise and fall of Cory Harrison, alongside the collapse of the Harrison pawn shop, is a poignant story of ambition gone awry, the corrosive effects of greed, and the dark underbelly of fame. Once a celebrated figure on the hit TV show Pawn Stars, Cory's life unraveled as his entanglement in a criminal empire surfaced. What was once perceived as a family-run success story turned into a nightmare of exploitation, trafficking, and money laundering. Cory, blinded by wealth and the power that came with it, played a pivotal role in a vast criminal network operating from the pawn shop's glittering counters. Despite the public persona of a witty, likable character, behind the scenes, Cory became complicit in his father Rick's criminal operations, overseeing the shop's darker dealings and ensuring the flow of illicit funds. As his actions were exposed, the trust of fans crumbled, and Cory was sentenced to life without parole for his involvement in the trafficking of vulnerable victims. Yet, the victims of this web of crime, whose lives were shattered in the process, have found their voices. Their courage and testimonies fuel the ongoing investigation, ensuring that while Cory's legacy is tainted, their pursuit of justice continues to burn brightly.